Today we're testing the much anticipated Huawei Watch GT4, and I've put this device through rigorous testing, not by making assumptions or repeating the big brand claims, but by systematic and scientific testing. Specifically, we will test the heart rate tracking accuracy, sleep tracking performance, GPS consistency, and SpO2 monitoring. And I have to say the Huawei Watch GT4 is a top performer in some of these categories, but even after some updates compared to previous generations, it still struggles in others. Hopefully this review will help you decide if the GT4 is the right choice for you, or if based on your needs another watch would be more suitable. Let's get started. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now in this video, I'll be putting both the 46 and the 41mm versions of the GT4 through some rigorous testing. However, before we get to the testing, I should mention that Huawei was nice enough to lend me some GT4s for testing, but I will go back to them after I'm done with them, and this video is not sponsored in any way. Also, as you know, I don't like going to the specs of watches too much, since you can find those on the manufacturer's website. However, in this case, because I'm testing the watches before release, there is some value in listing the most important features and also the changes compared to the previous generation. But let's try to do that in a limited amount of time, and there are also timestamps in the description below. Let's start the clock. Now the Huawei Watch GT4 comes in two sizes, 46 and 41mm, where the 46mm version is clearly aimed more at men and the 41mm version more at women. The 46mm version comes in four colors, black, brown, green and grey, with different types of straps for each, though the green one might not release everywhere. And the 41mm version comes in three colors, white, light gold and silver. Now in terms of design, the thing that to me stands out most is the octagonal bezel of the 46mm version. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan, but this is totally subjective of course. What I do like much more is the design of the 41mm version and the way that the screen lays flush with the watch bezel. Now in terms of heart rate tracking, the Huawei Watch GT4 now comes with the newer TrueScene 5.5 Plus algorithm, whereas the GT3 launched with the 5.0 Plus algorithm. Now it's not publicly known what Huawei exactly changed about the algorithm, but they say that they used AI algorithms to train individualized models based on your historical data that should improve the accuracy of the heart rate readings even under difficult conditions. They mention that it should be better now during running, for instance, and they also claim that the sensor should have improved accuracy in low temperature environments, as well as faster blood oxygen readings and enhanced sleep reading accuracy. Now the GT4 can also take continuous measurements of your heart rate, oxygen saturation and stress levels throughout the day. And although I cannot test it, the GT4 also has menstrual cycle management. It has version 3.0, which keeps track of menstrual cycles and tries to estimate the ovulation date by analyzing things like your heart rate during sleep, body temperature and breathing rate. Now the GT4 uses version 3.0 of the TrueSleep algorithm, which Huawei says has better sleep tracking accuracy now. Specifically, they say they try to estimate your sleep stages based on body movement, heart rate and HRV. Additionally, the GT4 now adds a new sleep breathing awareness feature that could help you identify symptoms of sleep apnea. Now, similar to one of the biggest brands in the smartwatch world, the Huawei GT4 also shows your daily activity in sort of a ringed format. These rings are now slightly altered compared to previous versions, with the first ring displaying the number of calories burned daily through different activities like walking or workouts, the second ring showing the total amount of time spent working out, and the third ring displaying the total amount of time the user has stayed active in any form, which includes simple things like standing up, for instance. Now for calorie tracking, Huawei says they now use a scientific calorie tracker where you can log the calories you consumed, and it also tracks your burnt calories automatically. Now I have no way to test this, but the general tracking of your burnt calories is actually really hard, and most devices give very different results, so I wouldn't overinterpret these results you get from any device, and that includes the GT4. The 46mm version of the GT4 now also comes with improved GPS or location tracking. The satellite signals are now automatically adjusted to follow the movement of the satellites in orbit, which should theoretically ensure that the direction of the signals is constantly pointed towards the sky. Huawei says that this improves the positioning accuracy by 30%, whatever that means, and that this ensures that the connection stays stable and accurate no matter if you're, for instance, doing an exercise with a lot of movement or if you're in a city with a lot of high-rise buildings. The Huawei Watch GT4 still comes with dual-frequency GPS using all 5 satellite systems, similar to what, for instance, some of the top-of-the-line Garmin and Coros devices are using. And Huawei claims that the 46mm version of the GT4 should last you about 2 weeks on a single charge, whereas the 41mm version lasts about 1 week. And this is roughly also what I found in my testing. You should be able to fully charge your GT4 in about 100 minutes. And finally, the watch is rated IP68 and is water resistant up to 5 atmospheres. Oh, and I shouldn't forget about the price. At the time I'm recording this, I don't know it yet, but I should be able to add it during editing right here. Wow, that was a lot of background info, but let's now get to the thing you've actually been waiting for, the systematic and scientific testing of the Huawei Watch GT4. As I mentioned, I'll be testing the sleep stage tracking, GPS tracking accuracy, and oxygen saturation measurements. But as always, I want to start off by testing the heart rate tracking performance of the GT4, which I tested for both the 46 and 41mm versions of the watch during a total of 3 indoor cycling workouts, 12 outdoor cycling workouts, 2 outdoor runs, 1 hike, and 4 weightlifting sessions. Now, to test the performance, I'll compare the heart rate measurements of the GT4 against the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, which can generally record my heart rate very accurately. And we'll start by looking at one of the easiest types of exercises for a watch to track, cycling indoors. And I'll be looking at a total of 3 interval spinning sessions. Now, this involves very little movement or tension on my arms and will therefore produce less noise. And here we can see an overview of that accuracy over all rides for the GT4. Now, each dot here is a single heart rate measurement, with along the horizontal axis the value according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and on the vertical axis the value according to the GT4. Now, the closer the points are to this blue line right here, the better the agreement, and the darker black the color, the more dots that there are. Now, here I'll be focusing on the 46mm version of the GT4, since most of you are likely gonna buy that one, but I'll also show you the performance of the 41mm version later. Now, as you can see, overall the agreement with the ECG chest strap is pretty good, or actually really good, I would say. Almost all points are on or close to the blue line, and only a few are away from it. And we can also see that the correlation, this R value up here, is really high at 0.99. This value cannot be higher than 1, so a value of 0.99 is really good. So I have to say, on first impression, this actually looks really good. However, let's now take a look at some of the individual training sessions to see if there's still any issues with the GT4 or if it's just almost perfect. And here you see the first example interval spinning session where we see a very good agreement between the Huawei Watch GT4 and the ECG chest strap. Now, along the horizontal axis we have the time, and my heart rate is along the vertical axis. In blue-green, I plotted my heart rate according to the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, and in red is my heart rate according to the GT4. And as you can see, the GT4 and the Polar H10 overlap almost perfectly, so there's almost no disagreement at all between the two. So for this ride, I would say that the GT4 was basically spot on. And we see this same thing for this second spinning session, well, at least for the most part. The GT4 basically detected the same heart rate as the Polar H10, only in this moment right here was there a slight deviation. Still, overall, I would say this looks almost perfect. And we basically see the same thing for this final spinning session, so the overlap between the GT4 and the H10 is almost perfect. Only in this moment right here, so in the beginning of the training, was there a slight deviation, but I would say this is negligible. Alright, that's honestly looking pretty good so far. However, to get a better understanding of how the GT4 performs, let's put these results into context. Let's compare them against more than 70 different watches I've previously tested. And here we can also see how the 41mm version compared to the 46mm version. This way you can determine what is the best watch for you. Now, that overview is displayed right here, and the correlation value I was talking about before is the metric we will use for this, which is displayed along the horizontal axis, and we want that value to be as close to 1 as possible. Now, on the vertical axis, I ordered the watches from worst to best, so the further to the right and the higher a device is, the better is its correlation with the reference device. And here I marked the 46mm version of the Huawei Watch GT4 in red, but as you can see, the 41mm version is really close. But it is quite difficult to read, honestly, so let's zoom in a bit. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here with just the watches of a correlation of 0.9 or higher, so just the best performing watches. And as you can see, even amongst the best performing watches, the Huawei Watch GT4 is still amongst the better performing watches. As you can see, the 46mm version and the 41mm version are performing about the same, and their performance seems to be really close to some other Huawei devices, for instance the Huawei Band 8, the Huawei Watch Fit 2, Huawei Watch GT3 Pro and Huawei Watch GT Runner. So generally the performance of the newer generation of Huawei devices is really good, and the GT4 appears to be no exception. Only Apple Watches are clearly outperforming Huawei watches still, but on the Android side of the ecosystem, Huawei appears to make some of the best heart rate trackers out there, and the GT4 is no exception, but of course they can also be used in iOS. So if you're in the market for a good heart rate tracker for cycling indoors, the Huawei Watch GT4 appears to be a good choice, but let's take a look at some of the other exercises as well. However, let's now take a look at a more difficult exercise for a watch to track, cycling outside. Now, cycling outside increases the tension on my arms because I have to hold on to the handlebars, and there's also much more movement and bumpiness, making it much harder for a watch to get a clean heart rate signal. Now, I tested the GT4 for a total of 11 bike rides, and as you will see, there were some minor issues, but it's still really good. And that overview is displayed right here, so a similar overview to before. And again, we want the points to be as close to this blue line as possible. And indeed, as you can see, most points are quite close to the blue line, though there is a bit more deviation away from it. And we can also see that based on the correlation value right here, which is now 0.92 instead of 0.99, so a bit lower. Still, this is quite good, but it's especially important now to look at the individual training sessions to see why that correlation value has dropped a bit. And here we have the first example bike ride with again the reference in blue-green and the Huawei Watch GT4 in red. And as you can see, there's a pretty good agreement between the two. It's not quite as perfect as we saw for indoor cycling, but still overall, this is much better than what we see for most watches. So it's able to pick up on most or all of the peaks and valleys in my heart rate. Only right here, where there were some really quick changes, did it lag behind a little bit, but still overall, this looks really good and much better than the majority of watches out there. And this ride right here looks honestly even a bit better. There's almost no deviation between the two. And that's basically what we see for all of the rides that I did. So there's a really good agreement between the GT4 and the Polar H10. And only in the very small details do we see some differences, like right here and right here, for instance, where the absolute peak in my heart rate was not detected. But still overall, I would say that this looks good enough for almost anybody wanting to track their heart rate. Out of all 11 rides that I did, this was the one that showed the biggest deviation. So in the second half of the training right here, do we see a bit of deviation with the Polar H10 ECG chest strap, but it's really minor. Only for this segment right here did it show a delay in picking up an increase in my heart rate, and here a slight delay in picking up a decrease in my heart rate. But still overall, it looks really good, I would say. But let's again put the performance of the GT4 into perspective by comparing it to many of the other watches I've tested in the past. And you can see that in this overview plot right here, where again, the more to the top right, the better the performance of a watch. And the Huawei Watch GT4 marked in red is doing really well, as you can see right here. But let's zoom in a bit so we can see it a bit better. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here, in this case with just the watches of a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, the Huawei Watch GT4 46mm version is among some of the top performers out there, but the same actually holds true for the 41mm version. Again, it has a slightly lower correlation, the same as what we also saw for cycling indoors, but they're very close and their performance should be about the same, but I can imagine there's a slightly increased light leakage for the smaller version, and also the watch straps that come with the 41mm version might not create such a snug fit as those of the 46mm version. So that could also be a reason why the 46mm version seems to be performing slightly better than the 41mm version, at least on me, or it could be random chance. Still, for both of them, I have nothing to complain about. They seem to be performing about as well as some other Huawei devices again, like the Huawei Band 8, the Huawei Watch GT3 Pro and the Huawei Watch GT Runner. So this is basically what I've come to expect from Huawei watches, that are some of the best heart rate trackers out there. Though based on these data, I cannot say, for instance, that the GT4 is better than the GT3 Pro or the GT Runner. They all seem to be performing about the same, and even the Huawei Band 8, which is quite cheap, is doing really well in this regard. Again, only Apple Watches are better than these Huawei devices. That being said, all of them are good choices when it comes to heart rate tracking, both for indoor and outdoor cycling. And just as a side note, the GT4 can be used on both Android and iOS and should have full functionality on both, but I did all my testing on Android in this case. Next, let's take a look at an exercise which is also important to many of you: running. Now, I'm not a very consistent runner, so I just did 2 short runs, but the results are really interesting. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. And of course, you'd also make me really happy and it will help my efforts if you subscribe, like and comment. But of course, this is totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance during running. And here you can see that overview similar to before, but now for running. And as you can see, most points are again close to the blue line, but there's two things to notice here. The first thing is that it seems that in the lower heart rate range, there's a bit more deviation. So here the points are quite close to the blue line, so in the higher heart rate range, but in the lower heart rate range right here, there seems to be a bit more spread in the points. And the second thing to notice is that in the higher heart rate range, the deviation seems to be above the blue line, indicating it detected a slightly too high heart rate value. Still, overall, this looks quite good, honestly, and the correlation is really high at a value of 0.95. But still, it's important to look at the individual training sessions to see if we can explain this slight deviation here in the higher heart rate range and the slightly larger spread in the lower heart rate range. And here we have the first interval run that I did, and honestly this looks pretty good. There's an almost perfect overlap between the GT4 and the Polar H10, so I don't have much to complain about here. Now a few times it doesn't seem to pick up on the full dip in my heart rate. You can see that right here, but also right here. Now this is very minor, but this could explain why in the lower heart rate range we saw a bit of deviation. And the second run right here actually explains this second artifact that we saw, namely that in the higher heart rate range it sometimes detected a too high heart rate by a few BPMs, and this seems to be because there was sometimes a slight delay in picking up a decrease in my heart rate after being at the peak of my heart rate. You can see that right here, for instance, but also right here and right here. Now, I'm not sure if there was an actual delay in picking up a decrease in my heart rate or if the timestamp was somehow shifted a little bit in the recording. Still, overall, this is a very minor issue, and I would say that for running, the GT4 performs quite well. Next, let's take a look at another difficult exercise for a watch to track, weightlifting. Now for weightlifting, it's not the movement per se that makes it hard to track your heart rate, but for this exercise it's much more difficult because of the increased tension on my wrist and on my arm, making it much harder for the watch to get a clean heart rate signal. And here you can see the overview for weightlifting, which I tested during a total of 4 mostly upper body weightlifting sessions. And as you can see, this looks pretty decent still, so the correlation is quite high at 0.83, or at least quite high for weightlifting. But we also see that there are some points below the blue line now, and they're mostly in the higher heart rate range, indicating that the watch seems to struggle from what most watches struggle from, though maybe a bit less than the other watches, namely the fact that it detects a too low heart rate at the peaks of my sets. And the correlation is now 0.83, which is decent but also not great. But let's take a look at those individual training sessions to see how often it was and was not able to pick up on the peaks in my heart rate. And here you can see the first example weightlifting session I wanted to share with you, with again the GT4 in red and the Polar H10 in blue. And you can ignore this last part right here where I forgot to turn off the Polar H10, so only during the first part right here was actually training. And you can actually see that during the training the GT4 wasn't always able to pick up on the peaks in my heart rate. In a few cases it was able to detect it, so for instance right here, but also right here and right here. But there were also many peaks, for instance these ones right here and these ones right here, where the GT4 wasn't able to pick up on that peak in my heart rate. And that's generally what we see for many of the training sessions. So for instance, for this one right here, it actually missed most of the peaks. And you can clearly see that in many cases, it kept detecting a too low heart rate, for instance, right here, but also right here and right here. But then again, some training sessions looked surprisingly good, like this one right here, where it was able to detect most of the peaks in my heart rate. So for instance, right here in the beginning, it detected almost everything. I would say that in the middle of the training, it captures the peaks almost completely. And near the end, it's also pretty good. And for this final training session, we actually see some good and some bad. So in the beginning, it did quite well, but here I also did some leg exercises, so it was much easier for the watch. But then the moment that I switched to upper body exercises, so for this part of the training right here, it really struggled again. And what I generally seem to notice looking at the different trainings that I did, that the moment I do back and biceps, it's quite okay. For legs, it's pretty good. But then the moment I do chest and triceps exercises, the watch really struggles. So I'm not sure if for those types of exercises, the tension on my arm is different, but this is just what I observed in my case. But again, it's important to put this into perspective, and we can do that by comparing the performance of the GT4 to that of many other watches I've tested in the past, and we see that in this overview right here. Again, the more to the top right, the better the performance of a watch. And as you can see, the GT4 marked here in red is doing quite well compared to other watches. But similar to before, we need to actually zoom in to read those labels. And that zoomed in view is displayed right here with just the watches of a correlation of 0.7 or higher. And as you can see, the GT4 is among some of the better performers out there. Also, we see that the 46mm version performed slightly better than the 41mm version, though they're basically performing the same, and is actually quite close in performance to some Huawei bands, so the Huawei Band 4, 6, 7 and 8. But interestingly, some other Huawei watches actually previously performed better on me, so the GT Runner for instance, but also the Watch Fit 2 and the GT3 Pro. Now, I'm not sure why these in my testing at least showed a better performance than the GT4. It could be random chance, or maybe it was hotter when I tested the GT4 and I sweated more. I'm really not sure. I didn't retest these, so these were tests from almost a year ago. So there could also be firmware differences. So I don't really know what to say here. These are the data that I have, and you can decide if a correlation of 0.82, 0.83 is good enough for your purposes. I would say generally, if you want to track your heart rate during weightlifting, just buy an ECG chest strap. This is the most reliable way of tracking your heart rate. And for weightlifting, it's honestly quite difficult for most watches to track your heart rate. But again, it's up to you. Finally, I did want to share the performance of the watch during a hike that I did in Spain. And here you can see my heart rate during a hike, which was generally around 100 BPM, but sometimes a bit higher and sometimes a bit lower. And as you can see, the general patterns in my heart rate match very well between the GT4 and the Polar H10. It really detects quite accurately when my heart rate increased and when it decreased again. Now, there were a few minor deviations, and mostly actually in this segment right here. Now, it's a bit difficult to see, but it wasn't able to pick up on the full peaks in my heart rate right here, and it actually detected a too high heart rate right here. But still, overall, this looks pretty good, and I would say that also for a calm workout like hiking, the GT4 is performing pretty well. Overall, I'm quite happy with the heart rate performance of the Huawei Watch GT4. It seems about as good as other Huawei devices, which is a good thing since Huawei is my second recommendation for purely heart rate tracking after the Apple Watch. I would therefore give the heart rate tracking of the Huawei Watch GT4 4.5 out of 5 stars. Let's now dive into a feature which is potentially even more important for tracking your health: sleep stage tracking. Just like most modern smartwatches, the GT4 tracks 4 sleep stages: light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, and awake time, if we count the latter as a sleep stage, that is. Now, to test the sleep stage tracking performance, we need to compare the GT4 against the reference. Now, I've tested many watches over the last years, and most of that time I've used the Dream 2 EEG headband as my daily reference, which in a study was shown to be good enough as a reference in my opinion. However, unfortunately, Dream has now gone bankrupt, and the company that acquired them has shut down the servers for normal consumers like myself, and I'm not sure if they're ever coming back. So I had to give up my dreams, yes, pun intended, and find a different solution. Luckily, Magdat, a very talented PhD student, wrote some software I can use combined with an EEG headband called the Z-Max to track my sleep stages. He actually recently wrote a preprint paper where you can see how well it performed on me compared to the gold standard for more than 40 nights, which I'll link below. So I'll be using that in the near future to test the sleep stage tracking of watches, and I tested both GT4s for 3 nights. Let's get to it. And here I show an overview of the sleep test results. Now, on top are the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG device, and on the left are the sleep stages as recorded by the GT4. Now, each column sums to 100%, meaning that we can see what percentage of each of the sleep stages according to the Z-Max was predicted as each sleep stage by the GT4. And if they perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal should be 100%. Now, I tested both the 46 and 41mm versions of the GT4 at the same time, and here I'll focus on the best performing watch, which is the 41mm version, but this was just not to get any comments from people out there that I was choosing the worst results. Overall, there wasn't a big difference between the two, and as you will see later, both are honestly pretty bad sleep stage trackers. Now, first of all, starting by looking at deep sleep, we see that about 46% of what was deep sleep according to the EEG device was also predicted as deep sleep by the Huawei watch, which isn't that good, honestly. Also, a really large amount was predicted as light sleep instead at about 38%. Now, looking at the individual nights will help us understand it even better. And here we see the first night I wanted to share with you. On top, we have the sleep stages as recorded by the EEG headband, with along the horizontal axis the clock time and my sleep stages on the vertical axis. And on the bottom, we have a similar plot, but now for the GT4. And here in purple, I highlighted the deep sleep as recorded by the EEG device. And as you can see, there's only a marginal agreement between the EEG device and the GT4. We see there's some overlap here in the beginning, but it also detected some REM sleep, for instance. And later on, there were these two short deep sleep segments that were not detected by the GT4. Now, it doesn't look terrible, but also not great. And we see more or less the same thing for this second night. There's a marginal overlap at best when it comes to the deep sleep detected by the GT4 and the EEG reference. Now, light sleep agreement was similar to what we saw for deep sleep at about 46%, but in this case there was both confusion with deep sleep and REM sleep, both at about 25 to 30%. So again, this is also not looking that great. We would hope for a much higher agreement, somewhere between 70 and 80%. Now, REM sleep agreement is also not that good at about 53%, which means that 53% of what the EEG device said was REM sleep was also detected as REM sleep by the Huawei Watch GT4. In this case, most confusion was with light sleep at about 35%. And again, we can very clearly see that marginal performance of the GT4 by looking at the individual nights. So this is a similar overview plot to before, but now I highlighted the EEG recorded REM sleep in red. And as you can see, the REM sleep recorded by the EEG device doesn't match very well to GT4. There's some overlap, for instance, right here, and even right here there's some overlap. But a lot of the REM sleep segments detected by the GT4 are not detected by the EEG device. And also vice versa, a lot of the EEG recorded REM sleep is not detected by the GT4. And this also means we cannot see the sleep cycles based on just the data from the GT4. So you go through roughly 4 to 6 sleep cycles each night, each one starting with light sleep and deep sleep marked here in blue, and each one ending in REM sleep marked here in red. And as you can see, I likely had 1, 2, 3, 4 complete sleep cycles this night. And based on just the data from the GT4, I wouldn't be able to see any of them. Now for this second example night, it looks a bit better. So we see a somewhat better overlap in terms of REM sleep, which also means we are somewhat able to see the sleep cycles. So this first one we would miss for sure, but this second, third and fourth we might be able to see at least somewhat based on the data from the GT4. But overall, based on all the data I've seen for both the 46 and 41mm version, the REM sleep agreement just isn't very good. And generally you wouldn't be able to see your REM sleep or your sleep cycles very well based on just the data from the GT4. Now, agreement of awake time detection seems the worst at about 20%, which means that only 20% of what was awake time according to the EEG device was also detected as awake time by the Huawei Watch GT4. In general, I have to say that both GT4s I had tend to detect very little awake time, so even a few moments I knew I was awake, it didn't detect it. On the flip side, the Zmax scoring is also designed to detect those really short awakenings, which many watches tend to ignore. So it could sometimes be by design that watches decide not to show you those really short awakenings, but in general I would say that even compared to other watches, the Huawei watches tend to detect very few awake moments. Now, most confusion of awake moments was with light sleep, which makes sense of course, as light sleep is the closest sleep stage to being awake. But there was also quite some confusion with REM sleep and even with deep sleep in this case. But we actually need to look at the individual nights to understand it a bit better, and that is displayed right here. So this is a similar overview plot to before, but now with the awake time as detected by the EEG device marked in green. Now, one big difference between the EEG device and the GT4 is that the EEG device is tuned to also detect a lot of these short awake moments, whereas on the other hand, the GT4 is not sensitive at all. Now, the question is, are we interested in all these short awake moments that generally wearables don't show you? I don't know, it could be interesting. I'm generally more interested in these long awake moments, but it also often doesn't detect the longer awake moments. So in this case, I would say there were 2 longer awake moments and it detected 1 out of 2 of these. But for most nights, the GT4 didn't detect any awake moments, like for this night right here, where I knew for sure I was awake for a bit and there were some longer awake moments, for instance right here, but also right here. And as you can see, the GT4 didn't detect any of these. So in general, as I said, my impression is that the GT4 is not very sensitive at all to detecting awake moments. What it is generally pretty good at is detecting the moment you fall asleep and the moment you wake up. So if you just want to track your total time in bed, the GT4 is good enough for this at least. And just for comparison, here on the right are the results for the same nights for the 46mm version of the Huawei Watch GT4. And as you can see, also this one isn't very good at sleep stage tracking. So mostly the patterns look very similar to what we also saw for the 41mm version. It actually shows a bit of a worse result for deep sleep agreement and REM sleep agreement. But based on this, my first impression is that for sleep stage tracking, I wouldn't recommend the Huawei Watch GT4. And just to show you that other devices do agree with the Z-Max quite a bit more, here we see the results for the same nights using the Oura Ring. So I previously showed, based on both polysomnography data, so the gold standard of sleep stage tracking, and another EEG reference, that the Oura Ring is pretty good at tracking your sleep stages. And also the results with the Z-Max confirm this. So these are the same nights that I also tested the GT4, and in this case we see a much better agreement with the EEG device. So this is more to show you that I have some trust in the Z-Max as a reference device, but it also shows you that there are other watches and wearables out there that are better sleep stage trackers than a GT4. So that honestly doesn't look too great for the Huawei Watch GT4. However, to put these results into context, we can compare the performance of the Huawei Watch GT4 to that of 40 other watches I tested previously. This graph shows you an overview of the agreement of different watches with the EEG device. Along the horizontal axis, we have the average agreement over the 4 individual sleep stages, and on the vertical axis, we have the agreement of the worst sleep stage. So the better the agreement, the more to the top right the device is. Now the watches here marked in blue were actually tested against the polysomnography device, which is the gold standard in sleep stage tracking, and the results not marked in blue were based on an EEG reference device called Dream 2, which I cannot use at the moment. But in general, the results based on the PSG device and those of the EEG device lead to very similar conclusions. And as you can see, the devices with the best agreement so far were different Apple Watches, in this case the Apple Watch Series 7, Series 8, the Apple Watch SE and the Apple Watch Ultra. The H-Sleep Pod 3 actually also performed very well, and other good devices include different Fitbits, the Whoop strap, the Withings Sleep Analyzer and the Oura Ring, though the agreement is not quite as good as that of the Apple Watches. Now, as I said before, I couldn't use my Dream 2 EEG headband as a reference for the comparison, so I used the Z-Max, and we will plot those results in here just to get a rough impression. So here in red, I plotted the performance of the 46 and 41mm versions of the Huawei Watch GT4 as compared to the Z-Max reference. And as you can see, their performance is about the same as many other Huawei watches and bands. So for instance, the Huawei Band 7, the Huawei Watch Fit 2, the Huawei Watch 3, the Huawei Watch GT3, the Huawei Watch Fit and Watch Fit 2 are in roughly the same area as where we also see the GT4. So I think that all these Huawei devices probably use a similar or the same sleep stage tracking algorithm and therefore lead to very similar results. And overall, this isn't a very good algorithm. It's really among some of the poorer performers out there. So as I said before, I wouldn't rely on the sleep stage tracking of the GT4 or of any other Huawei band or watch for that matter. If you want decent sleep stage tracking, get for instance a Whoop strap, an Oura Ring, or if you even want better sleep stage tracking, an H-Sleep Pod 3 or especially Apple Watches. So overall, the Huawei Watch GT4 doesn't appear to be a great sleep stage tracker, at least not on me. And as I mentioned, the only thing I would honestly use it for is tracking my total time spent in bed and not much else. Knowing your total time spent in bed is already important information, but just be aware that the sleep stages it presents might not be the most reliable. Therefore, overall, I'd give the sleep stage tracking performance of the GT4 2 out of 5 stars. Next, let's take a look at a feature that is generally dominated by Garmin, but for which we also saw in my last video that Coros was pretty good at, namely the GPS or location tracking. And as I mentioned, the GT4 should have all 5 satellite systems and dual frequency, which basically means it can use any satellite system available at 2 frequencies to theoretically get the best accuracy. The way I'll test the location tracking is by cycling the same route several times going to and from work and checking if the signals overlap really well, which would be good, or if there's a big divergence between the recorded signals, which would be bad. And here you can see the results for the 46mm version of the GT4, which is supposed to be slightly better than the 41mm version, since the 46mm version has this directional GPS signal thing, whereas the 41mm doesn't. But let's see if it makes a difference. So here are the results for 4 times I cycled back from work, and I always started the activity right here in front of the building, and I didn't give the watch any extra time to acquire the signal. So the first thing we can see is that the signal is acquired quite quickly. 3 times it was basically acquired instantly, once it might have taken 10 to 20 seconds. But overall, that's not bad. So it does seem that the signal is acquired quickly. The next question is, are the signals very consistent? So let's take a look. So in the beginning of the ride, we see it already looks pretty good. The signals are pretty consistent. Now, if we look a bit further along the ride, for instance, right here, we do see some deviations between the signals. That's not perfect, but it's still okay. And along this part of the route, it actually looks pretty good. I'm not disappointed with that performance. Though if we zoom in a bit, we do see some deviation right here where it's going through some buildings, so that's not that great. And also right here, we do see quite a bit of deviation between the 4 signals. It's not bad, but it's also not great. And right here, we also see some deviation. And in general, so far, I'm not really sure what to think of this yet. There's not a lot of big deviations, but there are some smaller weird deviations that do seem to go through buildings, for instance. So I'm not that sure yet. Maybe there's also some smoothing going on, or maybe the signals are pushed towards the roads artificially. Still, generally, it doesn't look that bad. Then if we go along the ride, we do see some more deviation right here, where we actually do see one of the signals goes through a building, so that doesn't look that great. Still, overall, there's also no big deviation. And then here further along the route, it does actually look quite good. So here the signals are quite consistent. And here again, it's a bit of a mix. So they're pretty consistent, but all of them for some reason are going through the building right here. And also down here, we see some parts which are pretty consistent right here, but also here some more deviation. So overall, it looks pretty okay. It's not exactly Garmin level good yet, but I think it might be good enough for most people. Just be aware that there will be some deviation, like you see for instance right here. But next, let's take a look at the 41mm version. And those results are displayed right here. So these are again 4 times I cycled back from work, but now the signals of the 41mm version. And as you can see, the signals are acquired pretty quickly again. Twice almost instantly, 2 times it might have taken 10 to 20 seconds. Still, that's pretty good. And then if we look at the consistency between the signals, again, we see here in the beginning, they are pretty consistent. There's a bit of deviation here, but overall for this first part, it actually looks really good. So the signals are really consistent right here. And also right here looks pretty good. But then again, in this part here, we again see more deviation, and especially right here, this doesn't look very good for this part. Also right here, we see some signals going through the buildings. And also right here, one of the signals keeps going through some buildings. Then if we look here further along the route, one of the signals really deviates a lot. And also here we see a bit more deviation. Then further along this ride, it looks okay, I would say, but again, not super consistent between the signals. And also right here, we see a bit more deviation than what we saw for the 46mm version. So indeed, based on these rides, I would say that the 46mm version looks a bit better than the 41mm version. Both aren't amazing, both are also not bad. I think they might be good enough for many, but be aware that there will be some deviations and the signal quality isn't as good as we saw for Garmin, for instance, and even something like the Coral Space 3 I recently tested. But let's quickly look at a few more rides and switch back to the 46mm version for that. So here we can see 3 times I cycled to work with the 46mm version of the GT4, and I always started my ride right on the corner here. And as you can see, the signals are basically acquired instantly and they're pretty accurate here on the corner, so that looks pretty good. Next, if we look at the consistency between the signals, it seems okay right here. So there's some deviation, but it isn't terrible. Then here we do see a bit more deviation, so some of the signals are going through buildings. Then right here it actually looks pretty okay, I would say. So here the signals are pretty consistent overall. And also going along this part of the ride, which is generally more easy for watches, it looks pretty good. The signals are overlapping quite well and they're really consistent between each other. So for the way to work right here, again, the 46mm version looks pretty okay. And now looking at the same thing, but now for the 41mm version, we again see that the signals are acquired quite quickly. So twice they're almost on the corner right here. One time the signal was a bit further away in the beginning, but then quickly went to the right position. So signal acquisition is pretty quick for both versions of the watch. But let's now look at the consistency between the signals for the 41mm version. And if we go along the route, we see that one of the signals here seems to be a bit deviating. Zooming out a bit, we see that it keeps deviating a bit. Then here it looks pretty okay, though again not as good maybe as the 46mm version. Though here I would say it looks pretty good. Also here it looks pretty good. So here I would say that for this part of the route, the 46 and 41mm version perform pretty similarly, though again with a bit more deviation potentially for the 41mm version. My initial impression based on these results is that the 46mm version might be doing slightly better than the 41mm version. Still, both of them are pretty okay, I would say. They're probably decent enough for many people, though there will be some deviations, and they're definitely not up to Garmin level, for instance, which is one of the better watches out there for GPS tracking. So maybe you just have to consider, is GPS the absolute priority for you, or is something like this good enough where you get a good impression of your ride, but there might be some deviations. So the GPS tracking performance of the GT4 is quite okay, I would say, though not amazing. It's not super noisy at the micro level, but we definitely saw some general deviation between the signals. Therefore, overall, I'd give the GPS tracking 3 to maybe 3.5 out of 5 stars. But moving on, let's shift our attention to a feature that might help some people uncover a previously unknown sleep disorder. I'm referring, of course, to the oxygen saturation measurements provided by the Huawei Watch GT4. Now, a reduced oxygen saturation is actually often found in people with sleep apnea, a condition where people experience brief pauses in breathing throughout the night. Now, the condition could potentially be identified by the watch's oxygen saturation measurements, as oxygen saturation decreases when you stop breathing. Now, where green light is typically used to record your heart rate, red and infrared light are often used to monitor your oxygen saturation. And I was curious to see whether the Huawei Watch GT4 could detect a decrease in oxygen saturation. To put it to the test, I took both watches with me on 2 airplane flights. In an aircraft, cabin air pressure reduces during the flight, effectively decreasing oxygen saturation, which thereby reduces the oxygen levels of my red blood cells. Let's see if the Huawei Watch GT4 was able to pick up on this. And here in pink, I plotted how my oxygen saturation varied according to the reference device during the first flight. Along the horizontal axis, we have the clock time, and my oxygen saturation is along the vertical axis. And as you can see, before we took off, my oxygen saturation was at normal levels. Then as the plane ascended, my oxygen saturation levels decreased. They stayed more or less low during the flight. Now there is some variation here, and this is probably noise in the data, so the reference device I use isn't perfect at all. It's a ring you wear on your finger, and it's pretty good at generally tracking your oxygen saturation. But because I was working, so typing on my laptop, it wasn't super accurate. But my only aim was actually just to see when my oxygen saturation decreased when we were in flight, and then when the plane descended again. And we can clearly see that based on this data. So as I said, here the plane ascended, my oxygen saturation stayed more or less low, and after the plane descended again, so right here we can see my oxygen saturation levels went back to normal levels. And we would hope that these are the general patterns that we also see based on the GT4. And here in green, I plotted the oxygen saturation measurements taken with the 46mm version of the GT4. And as you can see, these measurements don't match up very well with the reference device. Basically the whole time, so both before takeoff, during the flight and after landing, the GT4 kept detecting normal oxygen saturation levels. So all values are between 96 and 99%, and these are generally normal levels. But let's now take a look at the 41mm version of the GT4. And those results are displayed right here, and these look a tiny bit better, I would say. So before takeoff, the SpO2 levels are between 97 and 99%. Then during the flight, they are a little bit lower, so between 95 and 97%. And then after landing, they might seem to be increasing a bit again. But in general, it also couldn't detect the low oxygen saturation values I likely actually had. So normally during a flight, for me, my oxygen saturation drops to roughly 90-91%, which is also what the reference device detected. But the GT4 isn't able to detect this at all. And we see more or less the same thing for the second flight I took. So these are the results of the reference device for that second flight. So again, here, this is before takeoff, then when the plane was ascending, during the flight right here, and then the plane descended again right here, and levels went back to normal. And if we now in green plot the results of the GT4, so in this case the 46mm version, we see again a very poor agreement. Basically the whole time it kept detecting normal SpO2 levels. And if we look at the 41mm version, it did a bit better again. So again, we see a slight decrease during the flight with values between 95 and 97%, whereas before takeoff and after landing, the values are slightly higher, so between 97 and 99%. But again, it isn't able to go down to those really low levels that I probably actually had. So overall, this isn't looking that convincing for the GT4. So based on these results, I'm not a fan of the oxygen saturation measurements taken by the GT4. At least for me, it wasn't able to detect those major dips in my oxygen saturation. There might have been some minor decreases detected, but nowhere near the actual values. Therefore, overall, I'd give the oxygen saturation measurements of the GT4 2 out of 5 stars. Now, before getting to my final conclusions, it's important to note some of the limitations in my testing. First of all, I could only test these watches on me, which means I'm inherently limited to my own physiology. It could be that performance varies depending on factors like your skin tone, gender, and even whether or not you have tattoos on your wrist. Now, I do think my testing is a good first indication of the performance of this watch, but I do advise you to also check out other reviewers and see how well it performed on them. Now, I am working to overcome some of these limitations, but that's something that will take several weeks to months still. Also, if you want to know more about the reference devices I used, I provided some information in the description below. Quick interruption, I need to add some data. This is Rob from the future here. It's actually the day of release now, but I wanted to add some results to this video. I actually asked Theresa to also do some exercises with the Huawei Watch GT4, and she actually used the 41mm version with the metal strap, which means that the fit of the watch is likely less good and also it's much heavier. And this is interesting because this might influence the performance of the watch. Now, she did a bunch of exercises, but due to some issues with the data export, I only have the data for one run we did together and one weightlifting session. I'll start analyzing the data now and let's find out together what comes out. Let's start by looking at the results for the run that we did. And as you can see, also for Theresa, there's a really good correlation between the Polar H10 ECG chest strap and the Huawei Watch GT4. Almost all measurements are very close to the blue line, and also the correlation is super high at 0.98. So that's looking really good. Let's also have a quick look at the run itself. And here you can see the heart rate during the run itself. So again, the Polar H10 ECG chest strap is in blue and the Huawei Watch GT4 is in red. And as you can see, there's a really good agreement between the two. Only right here did it struggle a little bit, but overall the patterns are very similar and I'm very happy with this performance. And here you can see the results for a weightlifting session that Theresa did, and this looks less good, somewhat similar to mine I would say. So in this case there are some points close to the blue line, but there are also quite a few points away from the blue line. The correlation is also much lower at 0.75. But let's take a look at the session itself to see what the issues were. And here we have that weightlifting session where we can see in blue very clearly the peaks in heart rate for each of the sets that Theresa did. So each time she did a set of exercises, her heart rate increased, but the Huawei Watch GT4 was mostly not able to follow this. So for this first part of the training, we can see it kept detecting a too low heart rate. For this second half, interestingly enough, it sometimes had a delay in picking up a decrease in her heart rate, for instance right here and right here. Then near the end here, it was quite okay. Overall, though, this again confirms that most smartwatches aren't that good at tracking your heart rate during weightlifting, both on me and now we also see the same thing for Theresa. Luckily, the Huawei Watch GT4 does seem to be good during different cardio exercises, as we now also saw for running on Theresa. But what's my final conclusion on the Huawei Watch GT4? Well, Huawei still seems to have some of the best heart rate trackers out there, and it's basically the best device on Android. Only on iOS are they still outcompeted by the Apple Watch. When it comes to sleep stage tracking, not much seems to have improved, and Huawei is still not a brand I would recommend for that purpose. The GPS tracking was pretty okay on the other hand, and it's likely good enough, at least for me, for tracking my biking, and I suspect this also means it's decent for your runs, though this is something I did not specifically test. Finally, the oxygen saturation measurements were not as good as I'd hoped. I tested it on two watches and both really seemed to struggle correctly detecting a lowered oxygen saturation. Now, one other important thing to discuss is the limitations Huawei faces in the US. It might actually be difficult to even get the device in the US, and you might also need to install Huawei's own app store to get certain apps or use an APK, so it might be good to check if this would have an impact on your use case. Now, as a plus, the battery life of the Huawei Watch GT4 is really good. It's much better when comparing it to Apple or Samsung, for instance. I took my watch with me on a 5-day weekend and I didn't take the charger, and the 46mm version was still at 64% battery when we were on the plane back, so that's pretty decent. Therefore, overall, I give the Huawei Watch GT4 3.5 out of 5 stars. But for some of my purposes, I actually really like it, since tracking my heart rate during sports is quite important for me. So in the end, it really depends on what you need the watch for. If tracking your sports activities is your main use case, it's likely a pretty solid choice. However, for general health tracking, there might be better alternatives out there. I've actually made several overview videos of my general recommendations. I would, for instance, recommend the Oura Ring for health tracking, the Whoop strap as an all-rounder for health, sports and sleep, and Garmin or Coros combined with an ECG chest strap for the most accurate sports tracking. A budget-friendly alternative with decent heart rate tracking is actually the Huawei Band 8. Now, if you want to know more about why I recommend these devices, check out this video right here. In the meantime, if you want to support the channel, subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you so much for watching, and catch you in the next video.